So for you, why podcasts? Why were you interested in having podcasts be a medium where you could do this education, you could have these conversations, and you could tell these stories?
Two reasons. Number one, of course, it gets you out there, 1,000 points of light. I'm a very strong believer in that. Show up in a lot of places. It doesn't matter if it's a small podcast, big podcast, just show up. And as part of that, repurposing it onto our own, I do a weekly CEO briefing. I'm up to 247 so far in the Zoom era. Before that, I was doing them as phone calls, but I've kind of done this weekly thing forever, and I need content for that. So that's very important. The second part of it is I learn a lot. The questions podcasters ask are very useful. They're kind of like a survey says, because these podcasters are talking to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so they themselves are like, oh, yeah, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it makes me think, oh, yeah, that's a good angle. It makes us smarter. It gives us a more of a multi-point kind of point of view. And that's, in my opinion, the real strength of communication is when you're communicating from multiple points, not just one. I know that kind of sounds odd, but it's kind of like how the world is going multipolar, right? It's a similar thing. Things are becoming more fragmented, and as a result, you have to appeal to various different audiences in different ways and find the angle that works and so forth. And I have to say also, they also want me to tell me about my failures, which I've had to do. Yeah. And it's not a common thing in PR to talk about your failures, but it forces you to talk about it, and it makes you, I think, more human, more real to people. And you kind of, you get a dose of humility. It's like, I wasn't always perfect, still not perfect. I always, Jeremy, I always think, wow, I was dumb 5 years ago. Well, I'll think, what about in 5 years? I'll think how dumb I was today.
I'm always looking at it like, man, I made that choice last week. I'm glad I made the one I made this week. So I totally understand where you're coming from. But you know what? There's two things you hit on there, which I think is really interesting. As I mentioned, like we've been doing these icons interviews for a little bit. So I've had a few conversations before this one. You are the first one to bring up the idea of using it as a survey. That's really smart. I would have never thought of that. That's a really good point. And that's actually something, as a guest, I'm gonna have to try and bring into my own kind of toolkit now when I approach podcasts. It wasn't something I was considering. And I guess the other part about it too is going through those failures. I think now, kind of in this age of like everything's perfect social media and things like that, like those failures also humanize you. And I think for brands having to connect right now, I think being human when everything's becoming less human, I think is actually more important than ever. Is that something you've considered?
Yeah, and it also, I think, if Taylor Swift had some faults that she talked about, she'd be more armored against all the damn criticism. I think she's wonderful. She's getting unjustified criticism, but it's in part because she comes across as perfect.
Yes.
Right? She's just wonderful. She's got an incredible boyfriend, and she's on the covers of all the checkout stand magazines. I'm like, oh, really? She makes muffins too? And it's just ridiculous, right? So it'd be nice if Taylor's PR people were to come up with, the biggest failure is when I was living in a car, right? It was really, really, really good. Mm-hmm. So that basically makes it hard to attack you when you're already saying, yeah, you know what? I can tell you some stories about how I screwed up. Lord, ran a ship on the rocks and somehow got it off. Let me tell you about that. After that, it's like, yeah, okay, so he's got this and that flaw, but he's willing to talk about it, right? And the truth is here's another big deal. A big piece of my operating philosophy is what I trademarked in the early 2000s as mistake-based marketing. Because here's what happened in the year 2000. Up to the year 2000, we were paying for surveys. We were doing research and paying Michael Bach at survey.com, $35,000, $40,000 per survey. And they'd go out there and they'd do these impression surveys and so forth and so on. That was great. Year 2000, all the budgets went away. No more money for surveys. And so we literally had to just throw things out in the market. So what I learned was throw things out in the market, but we willing to take them right back and fix them. And that became this iterative process that is actually, in my opinion, even better than, yes, please survey, but also use have this sort of contact, and you get better and you go, oh, wow. So that also applies to business failures, right?
Mm-hmm.
The things I've learned from having been a ship captain and contemplating, here I am, my stupid first mate, I was literally on the can while he put the ship on the rocks. But guess what? I was the captain. And
Yeah.
I was sitting there in the middle of the night on a coral reef off the the Papuan coast in Papua New Guinea, the Louisiade archipelago, and going, wow, by morning, we could all be rowing ashore
My
in
gosh.
lifeboats, right? And like, oh my gosh. Well, we handled it. We took care of it. We got off. It was fine. It was all good. But the point is that, well, what the hell was I doing up on a coral reef in the first place, right? Like, gee, I mean, that's pretty wild. And I basically learned a lot of things about myself. So I believe that failure, properly processed rapidly enough,
Mhm.
gets you to success.